Our last speaker, Ken Kimmell, the Union of Concerned Scientists. Ken has more than 30 years of experience in government, environmental policy, and advocacy. Recently joined the Union of Concerned Scientists in May 2014 after 3 years as Commissioner of DEP. And also as Commissioner of DEP, he served as the Chairman of the Board of RGGI, which Kurt just recently mentioned. And since we are short on time, Ken, if you're ready.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everyone, or maybe just barely good afternoon. It's great to be here, and I appreciate the fact that we have this conference and that you're all still listening on day 3. One of the greatest joys I had in my state service actually was working with Senator Pacheco. He wrote one of his slides had a long list of bills that we worked on together, and I got the chance not only to work with the senator in drafting and getting those enacted, but also later in implementing them. And certainly my partnership with Kurt Spalding was also one of my professional highs, and having the federal government really behind Massachusetts in its push to be a leader. But I'm actually going to start by talking about the worst moment I had in public service when I was the Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Protection. This is Plum Island in March of 2013. And 3 huge storms, I think some of them were 500-year storms, battered that island one after another. And people who had invested all of their life savings, these are middle-class people in homes on the shoreline, saw their homes falling into the ocean. What happened afterwards, after this catastrophic incident, was a blame game. With the homeowners blaming MassDEP for causing this problem by not allowing the homeowners to put up boulders and rocks and defenses to the Atlantic Ocean. In fact, my agency participated in that blame game too, because we shot back and said, well, if you had listened to us and raised your houses up on pilings and moved it back, maybe this wouldn't have been so bad. I think all of us lost sight that the real culprit here was neither the MassDEP nor the homeowners. The real culprit is climate change. And Plum Island is a harbinger of our future if we don't take dramatic action now. This is from the National Climate Assessment, which, by the way, if you haven't spent some time with that document, I really strongly recommend it. It is one of the most user-friendly documents on climate change that I've ever seen. And what this graph points out is the way that different regions of the country are affected by climate change differently. And in the Northeast, the take-home is we've seen a 71% increase in the last 50 years in heavy storm events. And that clearly connects to what happened to those homeowners on Plum Island. And of course, the episodic storms are only part of the story. Sea level rise is also a part of it as well. We've seen an 8-inch increase in overall sea level now, and we're going to see somewhere between 6 to 16-inch sea level rise in the next 30 or 40 years, and the possibility of a 4-foot sea level rise by the year 2100 if we don't take action. And so the Plum Islands of the world won't be the exception, they will be the rule. So what is the Union of Concerned Scientists doing about this? We are trying to change the national conversation. We have states like Massachusetts that are way ahead of the curve, and we have states all over the country that are way behind the curve. And our view is that the best way to create a groundswell for national action, not just among blue states like Massachusetts or California, is to connect climate change to people's daily lives, to places that they love and places that they're familiar with. So just a few weeks ago, we issued a report, and maybe some of you saw it, and we picked about 15 iconic national landmarks all over the country, places that people love, that they identify with the United States. And we showed how climate change is already threatening some of these places and will continue to do so if we don't take action. So places like the Statue of Liberty, Jamestown, where we had the first settlement, various national parks in the West that are threatened by wildfires, et cetera. And what we're trying to do with this report is bring in a whole slew of people who haven't been paying as much attention to the climate change issue. People who are history buffs, who go to Civil War reenactments, people who love archaeology. But the fundamental message of this report and many others like it is that we are all very divided politically, but one thing we share is we all love this country, and we are trying to make the conversation such that it is patriotic to stop denying climate change and to start doing something about it. So we are doing this all over the country. This summer we'll be issuing reports on forest fires in Colorado and New Mexico, and we'll continue our work in states like Virginia and Florida to drive home that message of local impacts. Another thing we've been doing is talking to people and reaching out across the aisle. That's Senator Ayotte in New Hampshire. She was kind enough to host UCS scientists who gave her an in-depth briefing on the current state of climate science. We also met with former Governor Jeb Bush and briefed him on the current state of the science. Now, I can't say that we're responsible, but one thing you might notice, there were a lot of people who came out criticizing the EPA carbon rule a few weeks ago, but not Senator Ayotte and not former Governor Bush. And so maybe talking to these people as scientists and having an honest conversation, maybe that makes a difference. We also went down to Florida and worked with a local university and convened a whole number of local officials who are concerned about emergency planning, and we helped them assess the possible dangers to Miami with climate change. So this is an aerial photo of Miami Beach now. This is Miami Beach with 3 feet of sea level rise, which is well within the predicted numbers. So maps like this tend to concentrate the mind. And one of the things that was great, we had Senator Bill Nelson from Florida, who hasn't been that much of a leader on climate change attending. And we believe that he's really much more focused on this issue as a result of that. We are also supporting laws which may not be that popular in Massachusetts, I recognize that, but laws that take away over time the subsidies that we currently give to people to build homes and other structures in dangerous locations. And I know that that's a problem for people who own waterfront property in Massachusetts. I certainly heard a lot about that when I was at DEP. I think that the phase out has to be done over time, but it has to be done. And certainly the people in Plum Island, part of the reason why they're experiencing the problem they experienced is that the insurance rates were really underestimating the risk that they face. So we've got to do that. And we are also strongly supporting the President's $1 billion proposed resilience fund. We know from experience that it is beyond the capacity of local governments and state governments to pay for the types of infrastructure that will be needed to ward off the worst consequences of climate change. And just as our national iconic landmark study shows, we really are all in this together as a country, and it should be at the federal level that this is paid for, and President Obama's proposed resilience fund offers a vehicle for that. So we're supporting that strongly. But we can talk a lot about resilience. We can talk a lot about adaptation. But to UCS, the key thing is not to let those conversations divert us from the most fundamental task at hand. And I put up the 2 degrees centigrade. I know you're all familiar with that. That is the scientific consensus about the temperature increase that we need to hold the line to. And it's not that 1.9 centigrade temperature increase is okay, or that 2.1 is disastrous. It's obviously all relative. But most scientists will say that if we can hold the line at 2 degrees temperature increase, we have a shot at managing the worst possible consequences of climate change. But here's what's a little daunting about that 2 degrees. This is a graph that shows where we are on carbon emissions and the trajectory. And unfortunately, the trajectory we're on right now gets us to about a 5 degree centigrade increase in temperature by the end of the century. Now, maybe you don't think the difference between 2 degrees and 5 degrees is that big a deal, but think about your own body. You could handle a 2 degrees fever. Could you really survive if your body temperature went up by 5 degrees centigrade? Probably not. And what's most scary about 5 degrees centigrade, even the world's best scientists don't know what the world's going to look like at 5 degrees centigrade. The models are not capable of predicting with any assurance what kind of world we're going to be in. So if we want to hold the line at something like 2 degrees centigrade, I think you can see that we've got to basically immediately stabilize emissions, and then we've got to bend the curve downward very quickly. And that's really, as Senator Pacheco said, the defining issue of our time. The defining issue of our time is bending that curve down right away. How do we get there? We get there with a mix, a carbon fee, an infusion of renewable energy, energy efficiency, and clean vehicles. I'll talk a little bit about each one. In terms of a carbon fee, current estimates are in the United States that if we do nothing new, including no carbon rule, which I know has been proposed, but just for the sake of argument, if we do nothing new, our emissions are going to increase by 12% by 2040. A carbon fee of $25 a ton, increased by about 5% a year, would get us to about a 49% reduction by 2020, or I'm sorry, by 2025, and would get us to the really steep reductions we need by 2040. So to us, ultimately, that's the goal, a carbon fee of that magnitude. Now, to put that in perspective, as someone mentioned, I was involved with the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, something I'm very, very proud of. Right now, even with our efforts to lower the cap on the allowances, RGGI allowances are selling for about $5 a ton. They're predicted to get to about $10 a ton by 2020, and that's, with California, the strictest carbon pricing we have right now in the country, and even that is really not up to the job that we need to be to get the reductions we need. And so that's a very, very daunting aspect of this. Here's something that's encouraging. Current polling has been done on this issue. About 2/3 of the country is strongly supporting the proposed EPA standard to limit carbon emissions from power plants, and a solid majority of those people are saying they're in favor of this, even if it raises their electric bills. So I think the political consensus for this is forming. Another very, very hopeful sign is what's happening to the economics of renewable energy. The price of wind power has dropped dramatically, about 60% in the last 3 or 4 years. And we now see many states building wind turbines, not because they want to be green, but because the economics are excellent. Those flaming blue states, South Dakota and Iowa, they get 25% of their energy now from wind. A company called XL Energy just signed a long-term contract at 2.5 to 3.5 cents per kilowatt hour from Minnesota and Colorado. That's about 4 times the price of electricity in Massachusetts. So the economics are great and are helping. The same story is true with solar power. We've seen a dramatic decrease in the price of solar panels. It's dropped by about 60%. And we're now seeing, especially in the Southwest, large solar PV installations that are competitive with natural gas plants. A new one, for example, 150 megawatt solar array in Texas is now competitive with gas, even without things like the production tax credit and the federal incentives. But to really ramp up those renewables to where they need to be, we really need the carbon fee, because we're still in a situation where solar and wind are competing in an unlevel playing field with our fossil fuel emissions, because those coal plants and those gas plants, they get the benefit of a free sewer system in the form of our air, and the true cost of burning fossil fuels for electricity is not accounted for in our system. But with a $25 carbon fee, you would have a level playing field, and you would see this trend of solar and wind and other renewables really take off, and you would start to get to where you need to go to get the emissions that the scientists tell us we need. Of course, another big piece of the puzzle is energy efficiency, and that's probably the place where Massachusetts has been the most successful. And obviously, at a minimum, energy efficiency should be offsetting any continued electric growth. So how do we get there politically? I'm going to skip that one in the interest of time. I'll also say that a major part of UCS's work is also addressing the transportation part, which Kurt talked about. We have a plan to cut in half the projected oil use over the next 25 years. And that's based on efficiency that comes from the fuel standards that Kurt mentioned, but also technical innovation in the form of electric vehicles and better biofuels and smarter transportation. So that needs to be part of the mix as well. So how do we do this? How do we make it happen? I want to start by pointing out that if anyone is skeptical about whether we can do this, they have to look no further than Massachusetts to see that it can be done. In Massachusetts, we had the Green Communities Act, which required us to invest in all cost-effective energy efficiency. We joined RGGI, and we provided incentives for renewables. Here's what happened to the economy. 5,000 new clean energy firms, 80,000 new jobs, 11% annual growth, #1 in energy efficiency 3 years in a row. And then look at the emission side. This is the 9-state RGGI cap. And you can see that by the year 2020, that blue line will be half of the emissions that we were in 2005. So a 50% reduction in 15 years. So if you doubt that this can be done, look at our own state. There's nothing we did that involves rocket science. There's nothing that can't be duplicated everywhere else. So how do we get there? A great start is the carbon rule that Kurt talked about. That does require some states to start doing some of the things that we've been doing in Massachusetts. One of the most notable and impressive parts of the rule, and this really shows the depth to which EPA listened, is the flexibility. It's not an old-fashioned, you've got to install this particular technology on your plant. It is a rule that's all about flexibility that gives states a lot of different ways to get to their targets, and that's great. However, the performance standard that EPA has come up with, which is a 30% reduction by 2030, is in our mind far too modest. It's far too modest when you look at what the scientists are saying we need for emissions. It's also far too modest when you look at what states like Massachusetts have already done. If we're getting to 50% by 2020, it seems to me that the Ohio and the Indianas of the world should be challenged to do a little bit more than 30% by 2030. But it's a start, and it's a draft rule, and we now have the opportunity to submit expert analysis and mobilize our network to insist on more. And probably the place that we'll be focusing the most on is renewables. We do think that EPA may have underestimated the degree to which we can bring more renewables onto the grid. And if that assumption is changed, and we intend to show that that assumption should be changed, the performance standard could get stricter. But here's how this all plays out in my mind. You have a performance standard that really requires states to transform. You have the beginning of states forming things like regional greenhouse gas initiatives on their own. And eventually, you reach a tipping point where enough states have become leadership states and adopted progressive energy policies that Congress will follow suit, and a deal will be struck where we get a very stiff carbon fee at a national level that replaces all these individual state programs. And that is how we get success. And the EPA rule, plus a lot of advocacy in these states, is the way we get there. So my take-home points. Plum Island is our future, unless we take action now to prevent it from being more widespread. The key to mobilizing people in states that don't always agree with us is to connect climate change to things that are happening in their daily life. And third, we can do this. And I'm just going to end with this chart. This comes from the EPA, so you can rely upon this data. This shows a 40-year period. I chose 1970 because that's when the Clean Air Act was first passed, and it charts 40 years. So here's what's happened in those 40 years. Our economy has tripled. The number of vehicle miles has gone up. Population's gone up. Even energy use has gone up. Look what happened to the pollutants regulated under the Clean Air Act. They've dropped by 60%. And this is relevant because the very same things that everyone said about the Clean Air Act, and every time EPA submits a rule, the economy's going to tank, people are going to be thrown out of work, the lights aren't going to go on. That's what they're saying about the Carpenter rule right now. So remember this chart, because they're just saying the same things that history has proven not to be true, and it's not going to be true again. So that's where I'm going to end it. I thank you for your patience, and I look forward to working with all of you to make sure that Plum Island is not our future. Thank you.